Welcome on a rainy San Francisco day. My name is Gary Hart. I'm the board chair of PPIC, and on behalf of our board and the Institute, I want to welcome everyone to the Bechtel Conference Center for a special program about government governance and reform. We've got a great turnout today on a topic that's of vital importance to California's future. And I want to begin by thanking all of our sponsors for participation in our 2012 speaker series on California's future. They include the S.D. Bechtel Jr. Foundation, the James Irvine Foundation, the Pacific Life Foundation, Southern California Edison, the Stewart Foundation, Union Bank, and knowledge partner McKinsey & Company. This series is also funded by PPIC's Donors Circle, people who make unrestricted gifts to PPIC, and we're very grateful for that as well. One housekeeping item, if everyone could be sure to silence their cell phones, it would be greatly appreciated. And we want to just get right into the program, which will involve our panelists, Nicolas Berggruen, Antonia Hernández, and Nathan Gardels. And they're going to be joining PPIC's president and CEO, Mark Baldassare, for a conversation to explore ideas for building a better future for the state and restoring Californians' trust in government, a big challenge. Nicolas Berggruen is the founder and president of Berggruen Holdings, a private company with operations in the U.S., Europe, and Asia, as well as real estate and financial investments globally. He is president of the Nicolas Berggruen Institute and chair of the Institute's Think Long Committee for California. Antonia Hernández is also a member of the Think Long Committee for California. She is president and CEO of the California Community Foundation and is nationally recognized for her 3 decades in social action and the nonprofit sector, her expertise in philanthropy, and her lifelong devotion to underserved communities here in California and throughout the nation. Nathan Gardels is a senior advisor at the Nicolas Berggruen Institute. He has been editor of New Perspectives Quarterly, a journal of political and social thought, since it began publishing in 1985. He has written widely for leading national and international publications and is a media fellow of the World Economic Forum at Davos. So there's more to learn about all 3 of our panelists inside our program. So welcome to all of our panelists, and I'm going to turn the proceedings over to Mark Baldassare.
Thank you, Gary. And I want to thank everybody for taking time off during the lunch hour, braving the weather today in San Francisco, and joining us. I know that just both in terms of numbers and in looking at the list of who's here today, we have a lot of people, a lot of interested Californians who want to know what Think Long did and what might be next for California. I see that the sun is out now, so maybe that's a good omen. We'll take that as a starting point for our discussion today. And what I usually like to do is give my guests one question in advance to give them some time to think about. And the question which I asked this group, and then the rest of the questions, I have no idea where we're going to go with this. And by the way, I will make sure that there's time at the end of the program for questions from the audience. So I'll be mindful of your involvement later on. But I asked this particularly distinguished group to think about what is the most important change that we could make in California governance today that would lead to a better future for California. So I will start by asking Nicolas.
Thank you. First of all, I have to thank you, Mark, and I have to thank PPIC for hosting us, and thank you for coming. This is very, I've seen the list, it's a very impressive audience, so we are grateful. And some of you have indirectly or directly supported our efforts in terms of the work that Think Long has done. So I'm very grateful, because Think Long is, to answer your question, is all about California, and we've on purpose put together an effort which has been an incredible work of dedication on the part of whoever was a participant in Think Long to really think of California and think of needs and reforms for California. And California has all the characteristics of, let's say, one of the most successful environments in the world. Its proof is that we are here in a city that's been exceptionally vibrant and still is, in an auditorium that's been funded by one of the great companies and foundations of California. So all of this is a testament of the success, past success of California. And the idea of Think Long is how can we make sure that California can continue to be successful and renew itself. And it seems that in California, but in democracies in general, change is difficult. It's difficult because in any advanced society, you've got complicated structures and lots of stakeholders. And how do you, in a democracy, get everybody to agree to change? And that's really the reason why we created Think Long, is to address issues and address change, we think and we hope, for the better in an environment where change is resisted by the system. And that's really the goal of Think Long.
Do you want to leave it at that right now?
Well, I'm happy to continue.
Well, I would. I'd be interested in what you think is the most. Change is hard. Yes, I think we all agree, and I'd be interested in your thought about what is the one most important change we could make in California governance for a better future for California.
Well, I think going back to the initial idea, which is how do you reform and advance in a democratic environment? If you look at the history, let's say the recent history of California, you've had different governors, Republicans, Democrats, let's say Gray Davis, Governor Schwarzenegger, and now Governor Brown, all trying to make changes. And I think they genuinely wanted to progress things in California. It's been very, very hard for them to do it. So one of the things we'd like to do is to be able to help California make change, be more decisive in terms of things that need to be done for California, and allow for long-term planning and investment in California. What has made California so successful in the past was long-term planning and enormous investments in infrastructure and in education. Those things are difficult in in the present structure, and the structure is challenged because of the inability to make decisions by a governor, the inability of the legislature to come up with agreements that are bipartisan, and a tax system which doesn't allow really for long-term thinking and financing. So the things that need to be addressed is, frankly, give a little bit more power to the ones who, in theory, have the power, give a chance to the legislative bodies or bodies, government bodies, to think longer and to be able to make government, in essence, more effective in terms of its role, which is to govern and to work on long-term issues, and lastly, have a financing mechanism, meaning taxes and related, that allows the state to make long-term investments and to make long-term planning. I would say these are the key things.
Thank you. Antonia, what do you think we most need to change for a better future?
Well, I agree with Nicholas, and I, from a California perspective, I think we have several. One of them is we have a structural problem, inability to come to terms, to come to agreement, and to make decisions. So that's the process, the governance process with the governor, with the legislature, the lack of public trust in our elected officials. You can't really address specific issues if, in fact, the process for making decisions is broken. And so I think, one of the things that I look at is how can the processes and structures of governance in a democracy be changed to allow people from diverse perspectives to come together. That, to me, is very important. And that's one of the issues that Think Long California brought together. On a specific issue, I came in with a set of perceptions from the world that I function, thinking that, my particular issues were the important issues. What I found fascinating about Think Long California and our year together is that I came out with a different set of priorities. And for me, the issue that resonates is tax reform. And I equated to running a household. If I'm spending more than I'm bringing in, and I don't know what I'm spending the money in, it ain't gonna work. Okay? It just isn't gonna work. And we Californians, from a governance perspective, are spending more than we have. We're not raising sufficient revenues. We complain about the fact that we're not getting the services that we want, but we're not willing to pay for it. And part of it is that we're not willing to pay for it because we don't have the trust that they will be spent in a way that is effective and efficient and address the issue. So for me, education's important, pension reform is important, and you can go down the line. But if we don't get our financial tax system in order to support the kind and quality of life that we want in California, it's not going to work. So that's where I ended up.
I would say the same thing in a little bit different words, but what both of them said is that there is no silver bullet, because I think the point that they both made, and I think the presumption of the committee, the assumption of the committee, is the system is broken. The fact that our first meeting, we made a point, it's not the politicians, it's the system. We had Governor Schwarzenegger and the governor he recalled at the same table, the recalled and the recaller at the same table to start. The system is broken. There's not a silver bullet. What you want to return to is the spirit of pragmatism, bipartisan pragmatism, maybe even nonpartisan pragmatism, and long-term perspective associated with Pat Brown, with Earl Warren, who built the state of California. To do that, though, you need to unravel all the years that led up to this dysfunction. And that requires a series of structural changes that are integrated with each other, because it's not just one thing. It's returning power and resources to the localities that were concentrated by Prop 13. It's oversight and foresight, long-term government oversight to make sure people are getting their value on their tax dollars. And it's the tax and budget system, as you mentioned. We have a system that basically locks in spending and locks out revenues. So it's the structural integration of those reforms that's going to make a difference. One tweak here or one tweak there is not likely to fix it, because the problem is systemic. That was really the founding idea of the Think Long Committee.
Interesting. So I think that a lot of us who are here today, I would put myself in this camp, we're here partly because we want to try to understand how you came to the decision of this process and this people to try to fix what was wrong in California. So could each of you reflect on why the process of the Think Long Committee and the particular people who were represented in this committee? There's so many different ways that you can approach problem solving and making recommendations. Why the one that was chosen?
Well, I think Nathan, in essence, said it quite well. The idea was, let's address these structural issues. And the Institute is really concerned about structural issues, governance. And in this case, how do you address issues that are really at the core of the problems of California? These are structural issues. How do you do this in a way that's reasonably effective? We thought, and frankly, we didn't know when we started if it would work. And amazingly enough, as Antonia said, it worked, meaning we thought that we should design a way to get a group of people who are knowledgeable, thoughtful, and dedicated to California to work together. We thought, well, listen, at the end of the day, how best to solve a problem is to bring in people who are among, we think, the best, but also represent the diversity of California and truly represent also the, let's say, the two key parties, political parties, but bring them in a way that leaves, as Nathan said, the politics, outside of the debating forum. So we thought we'd bring in some of the best people we can think of, make sure that they're willing to work together, come up with solutions. We designed a group that is, well balanced. I think we have 15, pretty much equal between Democrats, Republicans, Northern, Southern California, men, women, racially diverse, diverse in terms of experience, and get them in the room and begin to address all the key issues. What was interesting is that the group not only from the very beginning, I think, identified the key issues, but worked truly in a very cooperative way and worked hard. With a lot of help from other experts on these issues. I think we had 12 meetings where pretty much everybody was there, and if they weren't there, they contributed one way or another, and we came up with serious long-term solutions. So I think the format of bringing in people who care and who were willing to take off their sort of partisan hat, that format turned out to be a format that actually was effective.
Well, people ask me, how did I get involved with Think Long California? And the answer was very simple. 2 people approached me, and there was Nathan and Nicolas. And I thought about it, and what made me decide to join the group was that I really felt that there was a sincere effort of bringing people together that truly loved California. Whether you're a Democrat, Republican, Northern, Southern, whatever, it's a true love of California. And understanding that it is broken, and understanding that there's going to have to be give and takes. I myself have been in hundreds of commissions, and I will tell you, it was one of the most cooperative, collegial group of people who came from an entirely, different perspectives. And I think that the building of that trust and the understanding that we had to do something, and that not everyone was going to get everything they wanted, the way they saw the world. And once we, sort of came to that conclusion that it was a give and take, and we had willing to listen, through a different perspective, then, things had started to come into play. So to me, the important thing, and I know that in the audience, many of you, most of you feel the same way. There's this deep love for the state that we live in, understanding that we live in a very special place in this world, that we are so lucky to be here. And to some sense, a recognition that we ourselves created the problem. Our love affair with the runaway initiative process, okay? and understanding that, we elected the folks, we voted for Prop 13, we did all this stuff, okay? It was we, the voters. So now how do we, the voters, undo this? And, undo the intended consequences and the unintended consequences. So, at the end of the day, it's about people coming together and our willingness to give and take. And I think that that's what distinguishes Think Long California.
I would just add to that wasn't easy. You make it sound easy, but you can imagine discussing tax policy with everyone ranging from George Shultz, former Secretary Shultz, to Gray Davis, the former governor. But I think the point is that everyone felt they had to make a compromise. Just to take the tax plan, we can talk about detail later, but Democrats on the committee didn't want to lower income rates at the top, but they thought it was important to help stem budget volatility. The Republicans didn't want to raise tax revenues. They wanted to cut budget more. But everyone was willing to give to make a bipartisan deal which they believed was sustainable. But let me just say two other quick things about the committee. The idea of the committee in the beginning, and I think it is a process that worked, was it had two elements. We tried to mix insiders and outsiders. Now, a lot of people will say, well, George Shultz is not an outsider, or Condi Wright's not an outsider, or Eric Schmidt's not an outsider. But with respect to state politics, they're outsiders. They live in the state. They're not involved in what goes on in Sacramento. They don't know the details. Laura Tyson, even, who was Clinton's economic advisor. On the other hand, you need people who know the system, like Bob Hertzberg, the former speaker, or former Governor Gray Davis, or Willie Brown. In order to, so you're not just, coming up with ideas that are completely not implementable. You have to know how the system works. So I think the combination of insiders and outsiders was very important. The depoliticized aspect, which a subset of that maybe would be, people weren't, maybe with a couple of exceptions, stakeholders in any active constituency. Because that's what you get in Sacramento. That's why you get gridlock. People can't bend, even if they want to, because they're beholden to their constituency. Then the final element, I think, is the incredible staff. Tim Gage is here today. We had also a bipartisan staff, so to speak. The best minds in Sacramento who've been there for years know the ins and outs of the budget. Tim, as people probably know, was a finance director under Gray Davis on the Democratic side, Mike Janess on the Republican side, who've been in ideological battles in the past, but worked on the numbers and worked on the reality and tried to work on a fix of the system. So that combination of expertise, insider, outsider, lack of active stakeholders, and depolitization, that makes, and then the final point which comes from that, I suppose, is that we didn't poll. We didn't poll what are the issues that we think are going to win with people. We said, what are the problems of the state and how do we fix them? Only when we came up with our final recommendations on all these range of things did we poll to see the next step, then how do you implement it? And what I hope is not the case is that good policy is bad politics, but that's an issue we can talk about because...
Yeah, that's right. Good. Well, it was a story for the last year which has fascinated people, the fact that Nicolas, who was not spending most of his time to California, came and committed to this process and got other people involved, and they were highly engaged in this process over the course of a year and produced a report. And I wanted to get into some of the details for those who are less familiar with all the recommendations. I mean, there are 8 or 9 areas we could talk about, but just in terms of how you position those sort of most important solutions and recommendations. One area that the report is very clear about is the importance of local empowerment, giving local governments and local citizens more authority and more responsibility, devolving activities from the state to local. Not something which is specific to Think Long, because many other people are now thinking about what can local governments do better that states can do. But I'd like for each of you to talk a little bit about where Think Long came down on the issue of local empowerment, and what does that mean to your group? in terms of how to implement more local authority?
Well, I think it's a very important subject. The state is a big state, 38 million or so, and growing. It's also physically big, but it's incredibly diverse. I mean, you've got, agricultural areas, you've got, manufacturing, you've got research, you've got very different areas. So we just felt that, and frankly, I think Antonia said it, there is not that much trust in government. And government, meaning in Sacramento, seems somewhat removed. And it is, frankly, physically removed from a lot of towns and localities. So we felt that if people are going to, over time, be willing to pay taxes, and maybe more taxes, to fund whatever they'd like, they would like to make sure that it's spent locally and that's spent to their benefits. So part of the power and part of the spending really should be devolved to localities, as long as it's monitored properly. And that's one of the recommendations of the committee, and we are, together with California Forward, we are sponsoring a 2012 ballot on accountability and government services. So we think it's a very important issue.
What does local empowerment mean to you, Antonia?
Well, I came from it from a different perspective, and a leery perspective. My prior life, I sued the federal government and the state over, sort of the differences in locality. Once again, revisiting. And so I was very leery. You give local control, and where is a sense of uniformity, equality, and application? So I thought, wait a minute, what's going on? But at the same time, I think all of us know, we all are part of families, we're all part of organizations, that you can't dictate every single crossing of the T and dotting of the I. Bakersfield is very different than San Francisco or Stockton, okay? Los Angeles, San Diego, Orange County. I mean, that's the beauty of California, our diversity, and we need to recognize that at the local level, people deal with issues a little different. So how do we provide parameters, but literally allow local people, to deal with the particular issues or deal with the same issue in a very slightly particular way? I mean, one of the interesting things in education, and you can name it, a whole bunch of issues, is the mandate. You can't do this, you can't do that. You're going to get a nickel, but then you're going to have to spend it this way, and it's going to cost you $10 to spend a nickel that the state or the government gives you. So it was the rebuilding of the trust, and you rebuild the trust at the local level. We all know that. Bonds that, that deal with local transportation pass. Education bonds pass because they're dealing with the local schools, whether it's water, whatever it is. People understand what their local government needs. They understand the potholes, they understand all that other stuff, and they're more willing to react to increasing their taxes, to paying more for getting those services, and in return, because they are there, they can hold their local government accountable. So to me, it makes some sense within the parameters of ensuring that there's some sense of conformity and uniformity within the applications. I come from LA County. There's 88 cities in LA County. It is 10 million people, and there's variances there also. So I guess it's sort of kind of, let's get real, let's get practical. How do we really live our lives? And we live our lives in our communities.
Nathan?
Well said. I would just amplify it by saying that this was the philosophical approach of the committee to try to make the state government leaner, and one way is to devolve or realign our decentralized power back to the localities that was reversed, as everyone knows, at Prop 13. You can call it small is beautiful, like Governor Brown did. You can call it realignment, like Governor Brown. Well, Governor Brown 1 called it small is beautiful. Governor Brown 2 calls it realignment. Proximity is legitimacy. It's if you can touch the government and you can see it, that was an important element. Now, what it actually meant for us is, in policy terms, in our jobs report, Doug Hinton and Julie Meyer-Reiter here and Joanne Cosberg, who work on the jobs report, we talked about California as a state of regions. It's a political unit, but it's really a series of economic regions. Changes in employment and jobs and manufacturing and investment, it comes from the bottom up. That's the way California is regions. What it means specifically, so we have a number of recommendations about doing that. In terms of putting money behind the idea, we've joined with Cal Forward, as Nicolas mentioned, and on the initiative, the government GPAA, Government Performance and Accountability Act. One aspect of which is to give more flexibility to localities on exactly the mandates from state funding, to get state funding that Antonia was talking about. That's a very important way, and to allow them to develop strategic action plans. Lenny Mendonca here is also who worked on that. Strategic action plans to join together and deal with the state mandates in a way that's more flexible and more useful and more practical and more efficient. And then the final way in our tax plan, which we can talk about more detail, we allocate in the plan. We raise $10 billion a year. 1.5 billion of that goes to the counties to deal with public safety, reduce prison costs from the state level, and also help cover some of realignment costs, and 1 billion to cities annually for self-determined activities. So it's a good concept, but if there's no money behind it, it's not going to work. And we've at least tried to move down that road of reversing the centralization that's happened, even as the state's grown more diverse.
Let me just say one more thing with it. What's interesting about Think Long, California, we weren't there to research and restudy. We knew that there were a lot of wonderful organizations, good government organizations, civic organizations, non-for-profits who were already doing great work. I'm also on the board of Cal Forward, and they had done a lot of wonderful work in researching the various options. We looked, to the experts, to what was out there, and wanting to bring those organizations together. So it was, in a way, bringing different institutions that had been working on the issue already, who had done the hard work, who had done the research, and combing through that to figure out, okay, where are the good practices? What has the research shown? And that helped us because, we were only there for a year. And so there was a lot to do, and you might agree or disagree with our conclusions, but I think we hit pretty much a lot of them based on the work that others had done.
Let's talk about taxes, because as Antonia mentioned, taxes became a key point of what the discussions were about. Certainly there have been other efforts to change the tax structure in California. Becky Morgan, who is here today, was involved with the Governor's Commission. Jerry Parsky, who was on your Think Long Committee, chaired that Governor's Commission, which made recommendations. You ended up in a place where you said that we need to broaden the tax base in California, but you also ended up in a place in which you said we need to expand the tax dollars in California. And you ended up in a place which is sort of different from where a lot of the conversations were by the time your report came out in December, which was more along the lines of tax the rich, tax the rich, tax the rich. And so tell me about how you got to where you are as a bipartisan group making the recommendations that you did on tax policy for California.
Well, the taxes are complex
Definitely.
issue. And we looked really at what are taxes for? They're there to finance services, and to finance also infrastructure. So the revenues, number one, need to be there, meaning they need to be reasonably reliable, and they need to be there not only tomorrow, but one generation from now. So we needed to really look at the entire system to see, is the system today adequate to finance what the state needs? And it's quite clear that it's inadequate in a few different ways. One, not enough money today. Two, very volatile. When incomes are good, lots of money comes in. There could even be a surplus. But in the last few years, with a poor economy, you have the opposite. So volatility, unpredictability, and not enough money. So we needed to address these issues. And we came up with something that is, frankly, truly difficult, because we have ideologically very different stakeholders. And, but we came up with a compromise which took a whole year to work out, but a true compromise on, I would say, one, bringing in adequate amount of revenues. Two, making sure that it's not too volatile. And thirdly, that it's something that we thought was fair, in the sense that it didn't penalize one side or put all the burden on one side versus others. So we try to make it as fair as possible. And we also try to design a system that we think is a modern system, meaning a tax system that addresses the change in the state. The state used to be a manufacturing agricultural state. And you've got sales tax on purchases of goods. But the state today is mostly a service economy, on which you don't have sales tax. So we felt, well, to be fair, and if you want a reasonably steady source of financing that's there long-term to finance infrastructure and other needs, you've got to have, and it would be fair to have a uniform sales tax, not just on goods and agricultural production, but also on services. And we felt that it should be at a reasonable level, in this case 5%, and that the ones who would be hurt, let's say the poor here, would get rebates to at least neutralize the effect on the ones that would be hurt the most. But that way you have long-term financing available to the state from the economy, the entire economy of California. So this would raise a fair amount of revenues. And on the other hand, not only, so what do we do with these revenues? Obviously we finance what is needed in the state, but also it gives enough capital to reduce rates at every tax level, middle, high, and low, so that at every tax bracket, citizens get a low tax rate, and also take the corporate tax rate and make it competitive with the nation's corporate tax rate. So the corporate tax rate in California today is much higher than the rest of the nation, and we didn't want to bring it lower, but at least at the same level. One of the issues of California is that corporations, after a certain level, will take employees and therefore jobs outside of the state, because the state is an expensive state to operate in. So the idea was to come up with a tax system that's, we think, balanced, that's fair, and can finance the long-term future of the state.
Well, for me, the issue of taxes, and as I said, it was interesting to me to see the evolution of my thinking of why tax was the one that I thought the most important. And I'll share it with you via a couple of conversations I had with people who approached me. when first, the promotion of taxing services. And to me, it was very simple. The state of California and how it gets its taxes has changed. Whether we want to recognize it or not, we're no longer a manufacturing state. We're no longer a manufacturing country. We would like to be, and we should have certain manufacturing done in this country and in this state, but the fact is that we don't. And so what is the economy of California, and how do we tax it in an equitable, fair way? So that was number one. And a friend of mine said, well, what the heck are you doing with taxes? You don't know anything about taxes. Which is quite true. I mean, I'm not going to deny, But I said, look, to me, I go into Marshall's, one of my favorite stores, and I buy one of those fabulous suits on sale, and I pay taxes. A seamstress made that dress. Pay taxes on it. So I go to the baker and buy my favorite baking, and I don't pay tax. It's a service. To an attorney, you don't pay tax. And so the question is, what is it that's going to give us that base of revenue to pay for the quality of life that we want? And so that, secondly, for me was, and I'm a firm believer, if you don't got the money, you don't spend it. So how do we stop our legislators, from enacting new programs, new initiatives that we have no money to pay for? And then we keep demanding, we want this, we the public, we want this, we want that, we want this, we want that, and how are you going to pay for it? So, sort of a sense of controls of the fact that right now, with the personal income tax, we're in a great economy, Facebook just went public and we're going to get some dough. And what happens? The legislatures go and adopt a program, not for 1 year, but forever. And the surplus in revenue just comes in one time, and what happens to the rest? So we have, one-time revenue and long-term expenditures. So I sort of looked at this issue from a very practical perspective. And taxation is no different. Revenue and taxation is no different than running a household. You can't spend what you don't have. You got to make priorities. You got to, deal with that. So to me, it was, number one, a steady state of revenue, removing the volatility. Secondly, fairness and equity. And, I'm a civil rights lawyer, and to me, fairness and equity is really important. And, just soaking it to the rich, just because they're rich, just doesn't do it for me. I mean, it just doesn't. Is it fair? Is it equitable? Are they paying their fair share? And that's what resonates with me. And so that's what we did. So, I think it's, if you leave this conversation and you go home and think about your expectations of governance and government, and then your willingness to pay for it, that should give you a sense as you look in the future, because this issue is not going to go away. Okay, this issue of how we raise revenues was going to be with us for a while. Think about it. Is it fair? Is it rational? Does it make sense? Does it resonate the way I think of things? And to me, that was the way I dealt with it. And I will tell you, to me, we need to address that issue. And Think Long California didn't put the tax initiative, but it doesn't mean that it's dead. We're going to come forward, and we're going to have to deal with that issue going forward.
Nathan, let me switch up the question in the interest of
That's
time.
not fair.
And ask you to. No, I'm going to ask you to address a question related to taxes and your tax proposal. And that is, where did the group come down in terms of Prop 13, which Antonia mentioned early on? We've got the issue of local empowerment. We have got the issue of taxation. Were there discussions about Prop 13 and changing Prop 13?
Not extensive discussions. I said
Why not?
earlier that we didn't poll.
I see.
And you don't have to poll to know where people stand on Prop 13, which is kind of a sacred thing. And that was two things. That we don't want to go into a huge battle with the public just off the bat, but also because of what Nicolas and Antonia were saying about the changing nature of the economy, which has become much more of a service and information economy than a manufacturing economy, and even an economy that's become less dependent on property taxes. The salient figure is we have a $2 trillion economy, and roughly $1 trillion of that is services and information, which completely escape taxation. As Antonia was suggesting, if you buy a donut in a coffee shop, you'll pay a tax, but if you buy a legal service, you don't pay a tax. So we really looked at that vein because that is really the future of California. We want to look to the future instead of the past. So I think there were political reasons, not directly, but kind of, why take on a battle that has been fought a million times before and lost? Let's go a different direction.
Right.
So that was the main reason. I did want to add, can I add a couple of things?
Well, of course you can.
Okay. I did want to...
Unless somebody wants to say something else about Prop 13. No. Okay. All right.
I just wanted to add some figures to what's happened in California over 30 years. You can't see this chart. Actually, you can't see the numbers, but you can see the colors, right? Basically, in the 1950s, California income tax, 11% of revenues. By 2000, by our time now, it's almost 60%. Back in 1950, sales and use taxes were way up here. They were 60% of the budget. Now they're way down here. So essentially, if you want to have a stable revenue and you want to end the volatility of the budget, the IPO Google, the legislative analyst calls it IPO Google and Facebook IPO budget. We're hoping for IPOs so money comes in. Otherwise, it's not sustainable. And we try to say we got to look beyond that, because I think when Google went public, if I remember the figures, there was 11 billion in income revenues that year, and from capital gains and income, 8 guys at Google paid $1 billion of that. And as Antonia said, what happens is that then the money is spent, one-time money is spent for long-term programs. So it creates chaos. And so the legislative analysts, their central analysis of California's budget woes is this volatility, and that's really what we tried to address. So part of it is again, good policy, bad politics. Reducing the income tax on the higher end to a certain extent to reduce the volatility that's necessary, to broaden the base, and then as Nicolas mentioned, we try to make it fair, the consequences of the incidence of taxation that would fall across all income categories. And Irvine Foundation, helped us a lot with incidence study, which we did like 23 rounds of what happens if you have and I think this is an important point to make, what happens, which wouldn't happen in politics, you wouldn't get this far. You have to have a rebate for the poor, you want to expand the tax credit for the middle class, you want to make, people make $92,000 a year to get 2% tax rate, and someone higher paying 7.5%. We went through all the models to make sure it was as fair as possible if you moved into this new system. And that kind of thing is not possible, to go back to your first question, in a politicized environment. You couldn't even get to step one. You nonetheless go through 23 scenarios to figure out what works on all counts.
I'm sure there are a lot of burning questions in this audience, and I want to make sure to give time for those questions to be asked. So, who's got a question for one of our panelists? Yes.
And the Government Performance and Accountability Act, that there were some considerations of equity in these discussions, and how can you not, in a state like California, where the majority is increasingly made up of people of color, and the diversity of concerns that presents. What would you suggest for other reform groups in terms of how they can approach racial equity when we talk about reforms, dealing with tax policy, dealing with things like initiative reform and other reforms from your experiences?
A good question. What did you learn that you can share with us about how to talk about equity?
Well, California is a majority-minority state. Equity applies across the board. And there are wealthy Latinos and poor Latinos and middle-class Latinos. And the same thing goes for everyone. So to me, it's equity for people in the issue of taxation. And I was very concerned about poor people, and particularly the impact of our new tax structure on the poor, their ability to pay. Will they lose income by paying more taxes? So I think and I believe in the issue of racial equity. Don't get me wrong, in the boardrooms and corporate America and all that other stuff, that all levels of government must be represented by the demographics of California. But interestingly enough, taxes, okay, it's really a class issue more than an ethnic issue. And to me, it was that the poor and the middle class, and really in California, we have unfortunately a large, sort of a percentage of poor. But the main part of that chart is the struggling middle class and the fact that the middle class is losing ground. And what sustains a democratic society is not the top or the bottom, but the vast middle, and protecting that vast middle. So from a tax perspective, that's how I looked at it.
That's a useful question, a useful answer to that important question. Yes.
I'm Jim DeLang, the chair of the San Francisco Interfaith Council. I question the whole devolution to local government. And there was a reason that started to happen more toward the state level before Proposition 13. There's a real public lack of interest in local government. And there is a lack of media paying attention to what local government is doing. So the opportunity for cronyism and corruption is very great at the local level. And it has happened, the record is that it would require a tremendous amount of oversight on the part of the Attorney General of the state to do that. Now, San Francisco is the exception to this because in San Francisco, one has a personal grievance that becomes public policy. But for most of the state, and I've lived in Southern California for many years before I moved here, and there's, people don't know who their supervisor is or city council member, or who do they care, or nor do they care.
I think this is a very good question. Either Nathan or Nicolas, I'm going to ask you to question of, we're empowering the local government, and now we're hearing that people aren't really in touch with their local government, and maybe their local government doesn't have the kind of oversight and transparency that's needed to give local government power now. It's something I've actually thought about too. How do you respond to that?
Well, we have some famous cases in Southern California, as you know.
Bell.
Yeah. Orange County.
All government requires oversight and checks and balances. And especially when the money starts flowing there, whether you're talking about California or communist China. It's more corrupt at the local level than at the state level often. But in the end, democracy is active citizens being engaged in the government that's closer to them and setting the rules for their lives. So I think the issue is oversight. The issue is not, it's a conundrum in a sense. The less power a locality has, the less citizens are really engaged in the government. The more power the locality has, the more citizens will be engaged because it makes a difference. There's rational choice theorists who always tell you this. If you're a big group of citizens and you're an individual, your return on your investment in activism is very small. If you're a small group of individuals and you're 10 instead of 100, your return on your investment in political activity is much higher. So there's always a matter of oversight, but the state, the centralization of power in the state has not been effective for California.
All right.
Prop 13.
A question here? Let's make it a short question.
I'm Aaron Anderson. I work for San Francisco State University.
Fantastic.
Quick question. In the meanwhile, these seem like long-term, long-range solutions. What do we do about public education and the inadequate funding immediately?
Okay. So I think that the report had some attention to education, particularly in as it relates to economic development and job creation and economic growth and future of California. Nicolas, where do you come down on the issue of what do we do with public education right now?
Education at the end is the bedrock of any civilized society. So it's almost the most important investment one can make. Let's be honest, it's a big political issue. Reforms long term probably will be needed, but how do you get these reforms done? We wanted to make sure first that two things would happen. And in our budget, in terms of the tax proposal, we had two things. One, more money going to education, and more money going to education at the local level. So again, we felt that if money is going to be invested in education, it should be something that is spent locally, because that's where it will have an impact, and the reforms themselves will be important over time, but you also need the capacity, which is you also need the investment in terms of money.
We can.
Londe Jose, California Competes.
Hi, Londe.
Hi. Hi, Mark. I was interested in the first opening comments about the lack of public trust that you mentioned kind of as part of the bedrock of why we encounter these kinds of issues. And I'm wondering about what you discussed or talked about as a solution to that, in part because it seems to me that the lack of public trust has actually now learned behavior, that it has become generational, that many people in my generation and the generations behind me actually don't know any differently in terms of actually being able to trust their public government. And without that, I don't know how you sustain all of the other work that you're talking about.
Who would like to answer that question? What do you do about the learned behavior of distrust that we have today?
Well, I think we all have an answer here.
Sure.
But true, I think it's a huge issue. The reason why we created this committee and the way we created it is, one, to depoliticize it so that at least the solutions that come out are not sort of, canned political answers. And part of the solutions that we've proposed are governance reforms. One of the proposals is to actually set up a committee, citizens committee, which will address foresight and oversight, two, I think, important issues. One, think of the long term, and two, make government more accountable. And the idea that this citizens committee is not a typically politicized, elected group, but is really a committee that represents the long-term interests of the state and are not subject to the short-term political influences. And, at least our view is that part of the issue is that people don't trust, or let's say are suspect of elections, because the elections are popular contests, number one, and they're very much partisan contests. And the idea is to take some of that away, closer towards what really government is in the business of doing, which is public service.
So that was, I think, a useful segue into the issue of the Citizens Oversight Commission, which is part of the Think Long proposal for how to deal with some of the structural problems in California. So it was interesting to see you relate that directly to the trust issue. I have a question in closing, because we're almost out of time, and that is, for a group like the Think Long Committee, how should we be thinking about how long it will take to make the changes that you're proposing? 2012, 2014, 2021, 2031. How do we? What's the length of time in your mind it will take to have the kind of change that is going to be significant for the future of California? Nicholas?
Well, I hate to say it, I think it's all the dates you mentioned.
Oh, okay.
So,
well, that's optimistic, though. There'll be some things this year.
Meaning there will be something in 2012, there will be something in 2014, but the reforms we're talking about are so deep and so structural. And by the way, I think it's very important. This committee we came up with recommendations, but the world changes. This committee is going to, number one, listen. This is why we have we're engaging the public. The recommendations will be modified over time. We're going to learn, and it'll be adapted to needs and experience. But to make these kind of changes, I think that's why the committee is called Think Long. The idea is that we'll be in business for California for many years to come.
So you're planning to continue the work of the committee then for many years?
No doubt.
That's good to hear. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time today. And can we give a round of applause for